The room was alive with a quiet kind of power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself but was felt in every glance, every carefully measured laugh, every handshake that carried more weight than a simple greeting. The grand ballroom of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, their reflections dancing across gold-trimmed walls. Soft jazz drifted through the air, weaving itself into the murmur of conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses, the calculated exchanges between Hollywood's elite. It was a gathering of industry power players, A-list celebrities, and the ever-present press, all circling one another like planets in a carefully balanced orbit. Tonight was about veterans' mental health, a noble cause, one that truly mattered to some of the guests. But for many, it was just another high-profile event, another opportunity to be seen, to make a statement, without saying too much. The room was filled with tailored suits and designer gowns, with smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, with whispered deals made under the guise of small talk. Some were here to support the cause, others simply to remind the world they existed. Waiters moved through the crowd with silver trays, offering flutes of champagne and aged whiskey. In one corner, a producer leaned in close to an actor, discussing a project that wasn't even greenlit yet. Across the room, a young influencer adjusted the angle of their phone, making sure the lighting was just right before snapping a photo. Everything here was polished, curated, deliberate. And then, with no fanfare, no grand entrance, Clint Eastwood walked in. And then, with no fanfare, no grand entrance, Clint Eastwood walked in. No entourage trailing behind him, no flashing cameras rushing to capture his arrival. Just him, moving through the room with the kind of presence that didn't need an introduction. He wore a well-fitted black suit, simple yet sharp, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. At 94, he moved slower than he once did. But there was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that commanded respect without demanding it. Conversations didn't stop completely, but they shifted. A few voices lowered, a few glances flicked in his direction. Some of the younger guests whispered to one another, recognizing him but unsure how to react. He wasn't the kind of celebrity people gushed over, he was the kind you acknowledged. He was Hollywood history standing in the middle of the room, and whether they admired him or not, everyone knew better than to ignore him. Eastwood didn't scan the room for cameras or make his way toward the most influential table. Instead, he moved with quiet purpose, heading toward a small group near the bar. A couple of longtime friends greeted him with firm handshakes, their smiles genuine, their words exchanged in low, familiar tones. He leaned in slightly as one of them spoke, listening more than talking, nodding occasionally. Unlike most people in this room, he didn't fill the silence with empty words or force laughter where it didn't belong. A few guests nearby watched, some with curiosity, others with the kind of admiration that comes with knowing you're in the presence of something rare. He wasn't here to impress anyone, and that was exactly why he did. Not far from where Eastwood stood, another man was watching. Younger, sharper in appearance, but lacking the quiet confidence that came with time. Brandon Keller scanned the room with a different kind of purpose. Where Eastwood carried the weight of decades in the industry, Keller carried the urgency of a man still trying to prove himself. He wasn't a household name, not yet. But in the world of online journalism, he was building a reputation, one that thrived on controversy. Writing for the Sentinel Review, he had made a name for himself as a fearless voice of a new generation, unafraid to challenge outdated ideas, unafraid to tear down relics of the past. And tonight, standing in a room full of Hollywood's elite, he saw an opportunity too good to pass up. His eyes locked onto Eastwood, studying him like a hunter sizing up his prey. To Keller, the old actor wasn't just another guest at this gala. He was a symbol, a representation of everything Hollywood was supposed to be moving past. The old guard, the outdated masculinity, the conservative values that, in Keller's mind, had no place in modern entertainment. This wasn't just a chance for an interview. This was a moment waiting to go viral. A confrontation with a legend. One that, if played right, could make headlines. Keller straightened his tie, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He could already picture the headlines. Clint Eastwood finally called out, watch him stumble over his own ignorance. He imagined the retweets, the comment sections flooded with praise for his fearless questioning. This was his moment, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. With a practiced motion, he checked to make sure it was recording. No mistakes, no technical difficulties. He wanted every second of this interaction documented, ready to be clipped, edited, and posted for maximum impact. Satisfied, he took a deep breath, rolled his shoulders back, and began walking. As he moved through the crowd, he felt a surge of confidence, the kind that comes when you believe you already know how the story ends. He wasn't nervous. Why would he be? He had taken down politicians, celebrities, business moguls. What was one old actor compared to that? He approached with the kind of smug determination that comes from a man who had already decided the outcome. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't yet see, was that the story he had in his head was about to unravel, and the ending he expected was never going to come. Keller moved through the crowd with purpose, his steps steady, his phone held casually but ready. He could feel the energy shifting as he neared the bar, where Eastwood stood among a small group, engaged in quiet conversation. The old actor wasn't holding court, wasn't making a spectacle of himself, just listening, nodding, exchanging words with people who actually mattered to him. But that didn't concern Keller. What mattered was getting Eastwood's attention, and, more importantly, getting a reaction. Without hesitation, Keller stepped forward, clearing his throat just loud enough to cut through the conversation. "Mr. Eastwood," he announced, flashing a tight-lipped smile. "Brandon Keller, the Sentinel Review. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" His voice carried, sharp and deliberate, designed to draw attention. A few nearby guests glanced over, sensing the shift in the air. Eastwood barely reacted, only offering the briefest glance in Keller's direction before returning to his conversation. The moment stretched just a little too long, and for the first time, Keller felt something unexpected: hesitation. He had been ignored before, of course, brushed off by politicians and celebrities who thought they were too important to answer his questions. But this was different. Eastwood wasn't brushing him off out of arrogance or self-importance. He simply didn't care. Keller wasn't about to let that stand. He took a small step closer, forcing a chuckle to mask his irritation. "I'll make it quick," he added, his tone lighter but still pressing. "I just wanted to get your thoughts on, well, Hollywood's changing landscape. You've been in the industry for over 60 years. Do you think people like you still have a place in it?" The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of something Keller had carefully crafted. It was a question disguised as curiosity, but the implication was clear. People like you. It wasn't just about age, it was about politics, it was about values. It was about whether or not Clint Eastwood, the last of a dying breed, still belonged in an industry that had seemingly moved past him. For a moment, Eastwood didn't say a word. He reached for his drink, took a slow sip, and set the glass back down with deliberate ease. The silence stretched, thick enough to be felt. Keller expected a quick response, something defensive, something he could latch onto. Instead, all he got was patience, indifference, and a stare that made it clear Eastwood had dealt with men like him before. And just like that, for the first time that evening, Keller felt the certainty he had walked in with begin to slip. Keller adjusted his stance, shifting his weight slightly as the silence stretched between them. He could feel eyes on him now, guests at nearby tables, a few journalists who had caught wind of the exchange, even the bartender who had paused mid-pour to listen. He wasn't rattled. At least, that's what he told himself. He had expected Eastwood to meet him with resistance, maybe even a sharp rebuttal, but this quiet dismissal, wasn't what he had prepared for. He needed to steer the conversation back into his control. He forced another chuckle, trying to shake off the moment. "Look, I get it," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "You've had an incredible career. No one's denying that. But Hollywood isn't what it used to be. It's evolving, moving forward. Audiences today don't want the same stories, the same old-fashioned values that defined your era. People are looking for something new, something progressive." He spread his hands, as if presenting an undeniable truth. "Don't you think it's time to make room for that? Or do you think people like you still get to decide what Hollywood should be?" It was a carefully designed question, one meant to put Eastwood on the defensive. If he pushed back, he'd sound stubborn, out of touch, unwilling to accept change. If he agreed, he'd be admitting irrelevance. Either way, Keller was sure he had him. Eastwood studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he exhaled, not in frustration, not in anger, but in something closer to amusement. "You rehearsed that one, didn't you?" His voice was calm, steady, like a man who had seen this play out too many times before. Keller blinked. "Excuse me?" Eastwood leaned against the bar, folding his arms. "That little speech of yours," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You practiced it, probably in front of a mirror. Ran through it a few times in your head before walking over here. Figured out the exact way to phrase it so you could cut it into a 30-second clip and post it online." He nodded slightly. "Not bad. But you see, that's the problem." Keller narrowed his eyes. "And what problem is that?" Eastwood took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down again. "You think progress means erasing the past. You think moving forward means tearing down what came before, like history's a mistake you need to correct." He shook his head. "That's not how it works, kid. Real progress doesn't come from pretending the past didn't happen. It comes from learning from it, taking what worked, fixing what didn't, and building something better." Keller opened his mouth to respond, but Eastwood wasn't finished. "But that's not what you're here to do, is it?" His voice was level, but there was something in his gaze. Something sharp, knowing. "You're not looking for a conversation. You're looking for a moment. Something you can spin into a headline, make yourself look good while trying to make me look like some relic of the past." He chuckled softly. "Problem is, you walked in here thinking I was going to stumble, that I'd get flustered, maybe say something you could twist into an outrage piece." He shook his head. "But that's not going to happen." Keller felt the shift in the room, the subtle change in energy. A few guests exchanged glances, murmurs passing between them. He could feel the narrative slipping from his grasp, could sense that Eastwood wasn't playing along the way he had hoped. He straightened his shoulders, trying to regain his footing. "I just think the industry should reflect the world we live in now," he pressed. "People don't want outdated ideals shoved down their throats anymore. They want stories that represent them." Eastwood studied him for a moment before nodding. "So tell them one." Keller frowned. "What?" "You keep talking about what people don't want," Eastwood said simply. "So tell them what they do want. Right now, say something that'll matter more than the stories I've told, the movies I've made, or the history I've been a part of." He leaned in slightly. "Go ahead. I'll wait." Keller hesitated. He hadn't expected that. He had expected Eastwood to get defensive, maybe to lash out, to dig his heels in about the way things used to be. But this put the weight of the conversation back on him. And for the first time, he didn't have an answer ready. Keller felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He had come in ready to control the narrative, but somehow it was slipping right through his fingers. His confidence wavered, but he couldn't afford to show it. He straightened his posture, forced a smirk, and tried one last time to regain control. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice a little tighter now, "it's easy for you to talk about learning from the past when you come from a generation that had it easier. The truth is, Hollywood is moving forward, and a lot of people your age are being left behind. The industry has changed. Maybe it's time to accept that." There it was, the argument Keller had been waiting to use, the final push to cement his point. He expected resistance, maybe even frustration. What he didn't expect was for Eastwood to laugh. It wasn't a loud, mocking laugh, but a short, knowing chuckle, like a man who had heard it all before. He shook his head, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Left behind?" he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen more Hollywood cycles than Keller could even begin to comprehend. "Son, I've outlived entire Hollywood trends. I've been written off more times than I can count, and yet here I am. And here you are, standing in front of me, using my name to try and make a headline." Keller's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but Eastwood wasn't finished. He leaned in slightly, his tone calm but firm. "See, that's the difference between you and me. You came here thinking if you tore me down, you'd build yourself up. But tearing something down doesn't mean you've built anything, kid. And you still haven't answered my question." Keller frowned. "What question?" Eastwood nodded. "I asked you to tell me something more meaningful than the movies I've made. Something that'll matter more than the work I've done. And you still got nothing." The room shifted. A few guests chuckled under their breath, while others exchanged knowing glances. Keller could feel it now, the slow, creeping realization that he had lost. His moment wasn't playing out the way he had imagined. He had walked in expecting to expose a Hollywood relic, but instead he had exposed himself. Keller opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind, which had been so sharp and calculated just moments ago, was suddenly blank. He had walked into this confrontation with a plan, a script that he had rehearsed, a moment that he was sure would play out in his favor. But now, standing in front of Clint Eastwood with the entire room watching, he realized something that sent a cold wave through his chest. He had miscalculated everything. The silence stretched unbearably, and in that silence, Keller felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him. His throat went dry, and he tried to swallow, but it only made the lump there feel heavier. A single bead of sweat traced a slow path down his temple, and he knew with painful clarity that he wasn't the one in control anymore. The balance of power had shifted, and he was the one under scrutiny. A quiet chuckle came from somewhere in the crowd, then another. It wasn't cruel, just amused, like people watching someone trip over their own feet after acting like they owned the room. A few guests clapped lightly, not out of malice, but as if acknowledging a performance that hadn't gone as planned. Keller had come here expecting to embarrass Eastwood, but somehow, without raising his voice or even looking like he was trying, Eastwood had turned the entire moment against him. Keller's fingers twitched at his side. His phone was still recording, still capturing everything. He had imagined this clip going viral for all the right reasons, for his reasons. But now, if this footage got out, he wouldn't be the fearless journalist exposing an old Hollywood legend. He would be the man who thought he could take down Clint Eastwood and failed spectacularly. Eastwood, completely unbothered, reached for his drink. He took a slow, measured sip, his expression as calm as ever, then set the glass down gently on the bar. He looked at Keller with something that wasn't quite pity, wasn't quite amusement, just the quiet understanding of a man who had seen this kind of thing play out too many times before. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he said two words that sealed the moment forever. "Thought so." Keller felt the words land like a final nail in a coffin. They weren't loud, they weren't aggressive, but they carried a finality that made his stomach sink. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to argue. He had walked into this thinking he was in control, but now, standing there with the room watching, he saw the truth. He had played himself. His face burned with humiliation, but he refused to let it show. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away, moving quickly through the crowd, no longer searching for attention, just an escape. No triumphant moment, no mic drop, just a man slipping away before the damage could get any worse. Behind him, the conversation in the room slowly resumed, as if nothing of importance had happened at all. And for the first time that evening, Keller realized the bitter truth. He had been forgettable. As Keller disappeared into the crowd, the tension in the room faded with him, melting back into the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the quiet negotiations that made nights like this more than just social gatherings. It was as if the moment had never happened, as if his attempt to make a name for himself had been swallowed whole by the very people he had hoped to impress. A few guests shook their heads, some smirked, others simply moved on, uninterested in lingering on a story that had already lost its impact. Nearby, a middle-aged producer let out a quiet chuckle, swirling the whiskey in his glass before glancing at Eastwood. "You didn't have to do him like that," he murmured, amusement clear in his voice. Eastwood barely looked over, just gave the smallest shrug as he reached for his drink. "I didn't do anything," he said simply, taking a sip. He walked into it himself. The producer grinned, shaking his head as if to say fair enough. Because it was true. Eastwood hadn't raised his voice, hadn't gone out of his way to humiliate the kid. He had just been himself, and that had been enough. And just like that, the night continued. Conversations picked up where they had left off, laughter floated through the air, and deals were made over candlelit tables. The music played on, and the weight of what had just happened faded into the background, lost in the endless cycle of Hollywood moments that came and went like waves on the shore. Eastwood, unbothered as ever, turned back to his original conversation, his focus never having strayed for long. Because in the end, this wasn't a story that would change anything. It was just another reminder that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one worth listening to.